Today we talk about Bobby Lee, a game published by Columbia Games. It is a war game that depicts the Eastern theater of the American Civil War, and it traces quite a big picture of it. You see the general theater of operations. It is a block war game in the tradition of other block war games by Columbia. This is the type of war games for which this publishing house is famous. And what I'm reviewing today is a new edition of the game that came out after a successful Kickstarter campaign. If you know previous editions of the game, the components will probably look different to you. One of the most obvious things in the game is that now the stickers on the blocks have a certain metallic look to them, which is something that I've seen in recent Columbia block games. As for the rules probably have been changed, modified, edited from previous editions, but I personally have not played previous editions, so I'm going to refer to this edition of the rules and of the game only in my video. This is a game that has quite a bit of meat to it. There's more meat in it than in most of the games by Columbia, so let's start talking about the specifics of the game without further ado. This is the map of the game. It is a map divided in hexes. It represents the Eastern theater of operations of the American Civil War. And here you have the setup. I've set up the game for the campaign game starting in 1861. Units belonging to the Union player are lined up there and ready to invade the South, and the Confederates are ready to defend. There are some Union units here, but the majority of the Union units are up there. Yes, the Confederate player is the defender. Technically, the Confederate player could win just by doing nothing, because the Confederate player during the game will continuously receive points simply for the time that passes. This puts the burden of the attacker on the Union player, who needs to advance and try to conquer locations on the map as fast as possible. Victory points in this game are earned by players that control enemy locations on the map. There are locations that are worth victory points, and again, the Confederate player simply receives points every turn. Units in this game are represented by wooden blocks with a sticker on them. During the game, usually wooden blocks will be standing on the board and facing the owning player, so that the owning player only can see the sticker on the block and the opponent will see the back, which means that the opponent will know where your units are but will not know exactly which unit corresponds to which block, which is a situation that creates fog of war. Each side has a supreme commander, Lincoln for the Union and Davis for the Confederates. Each supreme leader has steps, and those steps are spent, and to indicate that the player has spent a step on a supreme leader, you rotate the block of the leader. For example, this time the Lincoln has 4 steps. You rotate the block so that the 3-step side is up, and now that indicates that Lincoln has 3 steps. 2 steps. If Lincoln recovers a step, you rotate the block again. This applies also to steps of military commanders, such as this one. It also applies to strength points. Usually, the side that is facing up represents the present condition of the unit. This unit, for example, has 3 strength points. If it takes a hit, it goes down to 2, then goes down to 1. If it recovers, you simply rotate the other way. Very simple, very elegant way of keeping track of quite a bit of information on the blocks. Military commanders also have a yellow number here that indicates the range. During the game, players alternate activating units, and when you're activating your units, you need usually to activate your military commanders. You reveal a military commander. The commander can activate units within his range. In this case, the range of McClellan is of 1, and those units then can move and attack. The Supreme Commander activates not to activate units the way military commanders do, but the Supreme Commander orders strategic moves. So you spend steps to have units on the board perform strategic moves. And strategic moves allow you to move units by road anywhere on the board, so they do not need to be activated directly by a local commander, or you can order special types of movement, for example, using railroad or using sea moves or using pontoons across bridges. Units that are activated by a strategic move or by a military commander move. Hooray! Units that move with regular movement will move up to their movement allowance, and the number of movement points that the unit has is printed in the bottom left corner of the unit. Usually units move to their full movement allowance, but they have a penalty of -1 when they're attacking. And units also have a firepower, which is printed there in red, 2 for infantry, 1 for cavalry, 1 or 3 for artillery. One number is used to resolve fire at long range, the other one at short range, and the garrisons also have 1. Firepower is the number that players need to roll on a d6. They need to roll that number or less in order to hit an opponent. And when you are fighting in a combat, you roll a number of dice equal to your strength power. For example, if this unit is attacking an opponent, that unit will roll 3d6s and will hit on each die that rolls a 1 or a 2. Same as firepower or less. So units are activated on the board, they move, they try to conquer objectives, and they have to fight. Units fight when they share the same space with an enemy unit. Now, if either side has only 1 or 2 units involved in a fight, that fight is defined as a skirmish, and it is resolved following its own procedure, which is different from major battles. In a skirmish, the defender fires first and the attacker next. There is a single round of combat, and so in that round of combat, players roll dice and they try to inflict hits on the opponent. However, during a skirmish, all units fire at firepower of 1. That means that, for example, infantry is much less effective in skirmishes than in major battles. After that single round of combat, you apply hits. Remember, every time that a hit is applied, a block is rotated. The block that takes the hit is rotated. After all hits have been applied, maybe one of the 2 sides will be completely annihilated. In case both players still have blocks in the fight, the player with fewer blocks has to retreat. If there is a tie, it is the attacker that retreats. If both players have at least 3 units involved in the battle is resolved on this battle display here. You simply transfer the units from the board to this display. The display is divided in 2 halves, one controlled by one of the players, one by the other. In this example, this is the Confederate half, this is the Union half. And each half is divided in 3 areas: a left, center, right, and reserve area. Players deploy blocks so that they have at least a block in the left, 1 in the center and 1 in the right, and then additional blocks can be added to these areas and or to the reserve. Each battle turn starts with a retreat phase when players can choose to retreat their units. The units retreat from the battle display, they go back to the main map. However, if units that are engaged retreat, and a unit is engaged when it is sharing the same space with an opponent, if an engaged unit retreats, the unit takes a step of loss as attrition. Then there are also cases when units simply rout. Units rout when there is an enemy unit that is unopposed and unengaged in a friendly area. So in this case, there is an enemy unit which is unopposed and unengaged in an area belonging to the Confederate player. The Confederate forces rout. Routing is a mandatory retreat. All units of the routing side are involved and they all lose a step. After retreats have been performed, you have the morale phase. Engaged units that only have 1 step have to roll a die to see what their morale is, if they keep fighting or not. If you roll 1 to 3, the unit must disengage, it loses heart. If you roll 4 to 6 for that unit, nothing happens, the unit can keep fighting. And a loss of morale can indeed cause a rout if it happens in a friendly battle line position. Then units finally can attack. Well, units can attack or move, usually not both. There's only a special move called outflanking that will allow to do both. If you decide to move a unit as its action for the turn, the unit can engage, can disengage, can redeploy. Units can move from one of the 3 main areas to the reserve, or from the reserve to one of the areas. Units cannot move diagonally or horizontally between areas. Or there's also this special type of move that I mentioned earlier, which is called outflanking. If an enemy flank has already been engaged by one of your units, you can move units from your reserve to that flank. If you announce an outflank, you teleport the unit, you roll a die. The result may be that the unit joins the fight and can attack immediately, breaking the rule that usually you move or attack, but it may also be that you're not so lucky and the outflank maneuver doesn't work, the unit is returned to the reserve area, and it loses a step because of stragglers. Units that share the same area as the opponent can attack the opponent. Usual procedure, you roll a number of dice equal to the strength, power, you hit each time that you roll equal to or less than the firepower, and you inflict hits. This is the basic idea, but then there are a lot of sub-rules and cases that modify things. For example, infantry can choose to attack using melee instead of firepower, or instead of firing. If you use melee with an infantry unit, the unit has the firepower increased by 1, but also loses a step for each 6 that is rolled to simulate the extra damage, the extra attrition that is taken when performing melee. After the battle moves and attacks have been resolved, you have the reinforcement phase, in which units that at the present time are not directly involved in the battle yet can be brought in from the map to the battle. And then you repeat the procedure turn after turn, but not forever, at least not forever without specific rules happening. You have 4 battle turns that represent day turns. After that, you have a night turn. There's a track that you use to keep track of the battle turns that have been played. The 5th turn in a battle is a night battle, is a night turn, during which the attacker has to choose whether to continue the attack or not. In that case, the commander of the attacker needs to spend a resource point, needs to spend a step, and the defender at that point can also choose to stay in the battle or not. In that case, the defender also spends a step. And in that case, then both players are still in the battle and they start playing another day of battle, the second day of battle. If players do not spend steps, then they have to retreat. The attacker has to retreat first. If he decides not to keep the battle up by spending a step, the defender has to retreat if he decides not to or cannot match the step expenditure of the attacker. At the end of each turn, you have a supply phase, which is taken simultaneously by both players. Players need to check for supplies, that is, they need to demonstrate that the units are in supply, they have supply lines to supply sources, otherwise they suffer negative effects. Victory points are assigned for control of enemy towns, and the Confederate player simply receives points for still being in the game. Leader change. Players must roll to see if some of the leaders are replaced. If that happens, if that is the case, depending on the result of the dice, you have to draw a new leader from a pool of available leaders, and you simply have to replace one of your existing leaders with the newly drawn one. Replacements. Players receive replacement points, which can be used to replenish exhausted units, to replenish command points in commanders, and or to build new units. And finally, the Union player once per game can declare emancipation, in which case the player earns victory points but also gives replacement points to the opponent, to the Confederate player, to simulate the volunteers that join the fight after emancipation is declared. Also, both players can choose to to declare a draft to have new units. If a player chooses to draft new people, the player rolls a die and checks the result on this table. The result may be that the draft is useless, there is no unit that is actually raised, or the player may receive one cadre or two cadres. However, no matter what the result here is, when you declare a draft, you award a victory point to the opponent to represent, well, the loss in morale of your own side, because really nobody ever liked to be drafted. That's a given. That happened since ancient times. It is particularly true here. If you played other games by Columbia in the past, you probably recognize some of the ideas and mechanics that you also find in those games. Bobby Lee shares many things in common with other games by Columbia. For example, the activation system, where you activate a leader, which in turn activates units and expends resources in doing so, that you find in East Front, you find in other American Civil War games by Columbia. The fact that battles are resolved on a tactical display and then the pieces are returned to the main board that you have in Napoleon. But I like the fact that that some of these rules and ideas are shared by different games within the same philosophy, because that makes it easier to transfer your knowledge from one game to the other, makes it easier to start a new game by Columbia once you have played some of their games in the past. At the same time, the combination of rules is such that from game to game you still have enough difference so the different styles of warfare, different historical situations are captured and depicted by the mechanics. Complexity. Complexity is something that I think is important to address about this game. Bobby Lee is more complex than several of Columbia games that can be used as introductory war games. If you pick up Quebec 1759 or War of 1812, but even games all the way up to Julius Caesar, I think that those games can work very well to introduce a friend or even yourself to wargaming. That could be the first wargame that a person ever plays, and I think that person can easily get into the system and enjoy the game. Not so much with Bobby Lee, that definitely has more details, especially when it comes to the battle resolution, but also there are many other factors that I didn't mention here. Details about specific procedures around combat, but also around other factors that I did not mention in the interest of time, and it may take a little longer for a newer gamer to absorb. At the same time, the game doesn't have the level of complexity of some of the most complex games by Columbia, such as Rumble in the Desert or East Front. And those games are more involved. It takes longer than with Bobby Lee to get started, but then they have a level of depth, a level of complexity, not so much in the rules, but in the experience that you have, which makes learning the rules and learning the system worth it. So with Bobby Lee, we have something that I find is in between, and that in betweenness may be one of the reasons why this game is not one of the great classics by Columbia games. It's not one of the first games that people think of or talk about when talking about Columbia games, because it just seems to me that it may fall between two target audiences, and it may have a little bit of a hard time finding an exact specific slot in the world of wargaming. As an introductory wargame, it's not so great, and if you start playing war games at a certain level with a certain level of complexity and depth, then you may want to move on to other subjects. For the American Civil War, if you want a detailed simulation of, want to have a broad picture of the American Civil War, or at least one of the theaters, that just other games that can do that better. If you want a detailed simulation with all the complexity for the people, for example, is something that comes to mind from another publisher. To me, there is that aspect of that in-betweenness of an advanced introductory game or an introductory advanced game that I found, I don't know, it kept me a little lukewarm. It's almost as if something was out of focus in the experience. It was just enough fiddliness. There were just enough details to make the experience not a simple streamline, not like a fast ride through the events, and yet not enough to make it to give me the feeling that it was really sinking my teeth into like a meaty, detailed, fully satisfying experience. So I enjoyed the game. I didn't dislike it. I think it has a lot of merits. It's just like something was lacking in it to me, and it may be a completely subjective thing. I didn't have that tingling feeling down my spine like I have when I play other war games. War games that are either more complex or less complex. Now, of course, there are also games that are in between that somehow seem to be dealing better with that in betweenness. Here I found that there were some core rules which are extremely easy to grasp, which you should have in introductory war games, and then a certain level of detail added, which felt just like memorizing extra things without bringing the game to the next level. When looking at the board, that's the part that I like the most. I think that in the general organization of units on the board, there are a lot of interesting situations. Terrain plays a role. The Union has the burden of the attack and has to figure out how to puncture the border between the Union and the South, and to force the opponent to split strength, to split forces until you figure out a way to launch a massive attack in one of the possible parts of the border, and you start pushing your way through the south. That puzzle there of how to organize operation generally, I like very much. When transferring things to the tactical display, I just found that there the level of fiddliness got in the way a little bit. I guess I played many games by Columbia which have a more polished, more elegant, more straightforward, and more economical way of resolving combat with still enough detail, with still enough very tense, very interesting decisions. Here, well, there are tactical the decisions, and some are interesting. I just found that the system for resolving combat was a little too burdensome for what I expected the system to be, for what I expected a Columbia game to be. Without again resulting in a tactical death such as that it really made it worth to have to go through all the extra procedures that resulted from that system. So in conclusion, this is a good game. Somehow I did not fall in love with it. I expected to like it more. I did not dislike it. It's not like I will never play it again. It's just that Columbia and block wargaming in general offer many other options which just seem more likely to hit the table. With a new player, I will probably pull out a different game from the shelf. With an advanced wargamer, if I'm playing a game with a Grognard, I'll probably pull out a different game from the shelf. This one somehow is good. It's a good game. Not my favorite wargame about this topic. Not my favorite wargame by Columbia. Still a good option for several possible ways of approaching this topic. If you want to play a game about this topic, not as complex as Safe for the People, this is an option. Just not the best option in wargaming that there is out there. Not one of the greatest that I played recently.